The wagon lurched over another rut, and Margaret's stomach dropped with it. She gripped the wooden seat, knuckles white, trying not to look at her brother's face. Thomas hadn't spoken in 20 minutes, not since they'd left town, not since Mrs. Henderson had shouted from her porch about loose women and what kind of brother sends his sister to live with strange men. "Tommy," Margaret started. "Don't." His jaw was set like granite. The same jaw their father had, before the fever took him, before everything fell apart. "I just want to... I said don't, Maggie." Thomas flicked the reins harder than necessary. The horse snorted. "You think I want this? You think I got any other choice?" Margaret swallowed. The dress she wore, her only decent one, was already dusty from the road. It pulled tight across her middle, the seams straining. She'd let it out twice already. There was no more fabric to let. "The rent's 3 months past due," Thomas continued, staring straight ahead. "I got creditors breathing down my neck. Pa's debts didn't die with him. They just got handed to me like some kind of inheritance nobody wants." "I know. Do you?" He finally looked at her, and Margaret saw something she'd never seen in her brother's eyes before. Desperation. "Because I've been trying to keep us afloat since you were 16. 4 years, Maggie. 4 years of watching this town treat you like... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Margaret knew what the town thought of her. Too big, too plain, too much trouble. The Bellamy girl who'd never caught a husband. Never would. Her mother's death in childbirth had been blamed on her size even then, as if a baby could be guilty of being born wrong. "Thornhill Ranch pays $30 a month," Thomas said quietly, "plus room and board. That's more than you'd make anywhere else. Cooking for 30 men. Cooking for 30 men," he agreed. "Hard men. Ranch hands. But Mr. Thornhill's got a reputation for running a fair operation. No drinking on site, no gambling. He keeps order. He's also a widower." Margaret watched the prairie grass bend in waves. "People are already talking, Tommy. You heard Mrs. Henderson. People always talk." But his hands tightened on the reins. "Look, you meet him. You see the place. If it ain't right, if you get a bad feeling, I'll turn this wagon around. I swear it." Margaret nodded, even though they both knew it was a lie. There was no turning around, not with 3 months' rent due and winter coming, not with the general store refusing them credit and the landlord making threats about the sheriff. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. And if she didn't grab it, they'd both go under. Thornhill Ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage. Weathered buildings clustered around a main house, corrals spreading out in every direction. Horses dotted the pastures, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Margaret had never seen so many animals in one place. "Big operation," Thomas muttered. They passed under a wooden archway with Thornhill burned into the crossbeam. 2 men working near the fence stopped to stare. One of them elbowed the other, said something Margaret couldn't hear. They both laughed. Her stomach knotted. The main house was 2 stories, painted white once upon a time, but now weathered to gray. A wide porch wrapped around the front. Neat, but not fancy. Working-class prosperity, the kind built by sweat and years. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop near what looked like a cookhouse, a long, low building with a chimney already smoking. The door stood open, and Margaret could smell burned coffee. "Wait here," Thomas said, climbing down. But before he could take 3 steps, a man emerged from the main house. Callum Thornhill. Margaret knew it was him without being told. He had the bearing of someone who owned things, not arrogant exactly, but certain. Tall, maybe 40, with dark hair graying at the temples and lines around his eyes from squinting at the sun. He wore work clothes like his men, but they were cleaner, newer. "Mr. Bellamy." Thornhill's voice was deep, measured. He extended a hand. Thomas shook it. "Mr. Thornhill, this is my sister Margaret." Thornhill's eyes shifted to the wagon, to her. Margaret felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. She'd learned to recognize the moment someone sized her up and found her wanting. The slight pause. The flicker of something, disappointment maybe, or resignation. But Thornhill just nodded. "Miss Bellamy, welcome to Thornhill Ranch." He helped her down from the wagon himself. His hand was rough with calluses, but his grip was steady, respectful. "I'll show you the cookhouse," he said. "Mrs. Brennan, the last cook, left it in decent shape, but there's inventory to go through. The men eat at 6, noon, and 6. Breakfast is simple. Dinner's the main meal. You'll have help for washing up, but the cooking's all yours. 30 men? Margaret asked. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. 28 hands, me and my foreman. Jack's been splitting cooking duties since Mrs. Brennan left, and I think the men are about ready to mutiny. Thornhill almost smiled. Almost. Fair warning, they're used to simple food. Meat, potatoes, beans. They'll complain if you get fancy. I don't do fancy, Margaret said. This time he did smile. Barely. Good. He led them toward the cookhouse. Inside it was bigger than Margaret expected. One half kitchen, the other half a long dining area with 2 wooden tables and benches. The kitchen had a massive cast iron stove, a work table, shelves lined with tin containers, and a window that looked out over the ranch yard. Everything smelled like smoke and old grease. Water pumps outside, Thornhill said. We slaughter a steer every 2 weeks. Chickens lay daily. The coop's behind the bunkhouse. Root cellars stocked, but let me know if you need supplies from town. I send someone in Saturdays. Margaret nodded, trying to absorb it all. The stove alone was 3 times the size of the one she'd used at home. Thornhill walked to a door at the back of the kitchen. Your quarters. He opened it to reveal a small room, barely bigger than a closet, really. A narrow bed, a washstand, a trunk for clothes. One window with faded curtains. It ain't much, Thornhill admitted. It's private, Margaret said. And it was. After sharing a room with Thomas for 4 years, the idea of a door she could close felt like luxury. There's a necessary outback. You'll share it with the men, but there's a latch on the inside. Thornhill's tone was careful, professional. I run a clean operation, Miss Bellamy. No drinking, no gambling, no rough behavior. But you'll be the only woman on this ranch. If anyone gives you trouble, any kind of trouble, you come straight to me. Understood? Margaret met his eyes. They were gray, she noticed. The color of storm clouds. Understood, she said. Go. Thomas stayed for supper. Thornhill invited him as a courtesy, which meant Margaret had to cook her first meal for an audience. She worked fast, taking inventory as she went. Flour, plenty. Salt pork, enough. Dried beans, more than enough. Onions in the cellar, potatoes too. No fresh vegetables, but she hadn't expected any. This was ranch country, cattle country. Everything else was afterthought. She made biscuits because biscuits were safe. Hard to ruin, easy to stretch. While they baked, she fried up salt pork and made gravy from the drippings. Not fancy, not special, but hot and filling. The men started filing in at 6 sharp. Margaret had expected them to be loud, but they were eerily quiet. They took their seats in a specific order, clearly assigned over time, and watched her with the wariness of animals encountering something new in their territory. She served Thornhill and Thomas first, then started down the benches. Biscuits and gravy, announced a man near the end. He was young, maybe 25, with red hair and freckles. His tone dripped skepticism. Real adventurous. A few men snickered. Margaret set the plate in front of him without comment. Bet they're hard as rocks, Redhair continued. Last cook couldn't make a decent biscuit to save her life. Then don't eat them, Margaret said evenly. The snickering stopped. Redhair blinked at her, surprised. Then he picked up a biscuit, broke it open, steam rose from the middle, and took a bite. His expression changed. Well? Someone asked. They're good. Redhair sounded almost offended. They're actually good. Margaret moved to the next man, and the next, serving without ceremony, without smile, without trying to win anyone over. She'd learned a long time ago that trying to make people like her was a waste of effort. Better to just do the job. By the time she reached the end of the second table, most of the men were eating. A few watched her with curiosity now instead of contempt. Progress, maybe. Thomas caught her eye and nodded slightly. Approval. Thornhill ate without comment, but he cleaned his plate. When the meal ended, the men filed out as quietly as they'd come. A few muttered, "Ma'am," as they passed. Others said nothing. Redhair stopped at the door. Miss Bellamy? Margaret looked up from collecting plates. Biscuits were good, he said. Then he was gone. Thomas left after dark. He pressed $2 into Margaret's hand, money he didn't have, and hugged her tight. You'll be all right, he whispered. Margaret didn't answer. She wasn't sure if it was true. She watched the wagon disappear down the road, swallowed by darkness and distance. Then she turned back to the cookhouse, to the mountain of dishes waiting, to the small room that was now her entire world. The men had left the tables a mess. Gravy smeared across wood, biscuit crumbs everywhere, coffee spilled and not wiped up. Margaret filled a basin with hot water and got to work. Her hands were cracked and red by the time she finished. Her back ached. Her feet screamed. But the kitchen was clean, the tables scrubbed, everything ready for breakfast in, she checked the clock, 7 hours. She collapsed onto the narrow bed without bothering to undress. Sleep came fast, dreamless, and heavy. 4 a.m. came faster. Margaret woke to darkness and cold. Her first thought was that she'd overslept, that the men would be waiting, that she'd already failed. Then she remembered, breakfast at 6, 2 hours to prepare for 30 hungry men. She lit the lamp with shaking hands and got to work. Coffee first. The ranch ran on coffee. She'd learned that much watching Mrs. Brennan's replacement struggle. Strong enough to strip paint, hot enough to scald. Anything less was an insult. While it brewed, she mixed batter for flapjacks. Simple, fast, filling. She fried up more salt pork, set aside the grease for later. Scrambled 24 eggs. The chickens had been productive. By the time the first man walked through the door at 10 to 6, Margaret had everything ready. The man stopped short, surprised. He was older, maybe 50, with a weathered face and intelligent eyes. The foreman, Margaret guessed. "You're up early," he said. "Job starts at 6, Margaret replied. "Food's ready at 6. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Name's Jack Reeves. I'm the foreman here." "Margaret Bellamy." "I know." Jack poured himself coffee, took a sip, and something like respect flickered across his face. "Thornhill tell you about the last cook?" "Only that she left. She quit after 2 weeks, said the men were too rough. Before her we had an old fellow named Pete, drunk himself to death." Jack took another sip of coffee. "Before Pete there was a lady from town. She lasted 3 days." Margaret flipped a flapjack. "What happened?" "Men made her cry. She left in tears and never came back." Jack's tone was matter-of-fact. "These are hard men, Miss Bellamy. Been out here alone so long they forgot how to act around decent folk. They'll test you, push boundaries, see what breaks you." "I don't break easy," Margaret said. Jack smiled, genuinely smiled. "I'm starting to believe that." The men trickled in over the next 10 minutes. Same quiet, same wariness. But this time, when they saw the food already laid out, hot, ready, plenty of it, something shifted in the atmosphere. They ate. And when Redhair, Jimmy Carter, Jack called him, reached for a third flapjack, another hand intercepted his. "Leave some for the rest of us, Jimmy," the man said. Older, scarred, with forearms like tree trunks. Jimmy scowled but withdrew his hand. Margaret watched the exchange, understanding blooming. There was a hierarchy here. Rules. A pecking order she'd need to learn if she wanted to survive. Thornhill arrived last, just before 6. He surveyed the spread, the men already eating, Margaret at the stove flipping more flapjacks to keep the platters full. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." She poured him a cup. Their fingers brushed as she handed it over, brief, impersonal. But Margaret noticed he had ink stains on his thumb. Ledgers, probably. Ranch business. He took a sip and nodded. "Good." One word. But coming from him, in front of his men, it carried weight. Margaret returned to the stove, hiding a small, private victory. The days blurred together after that. 4 a.m. Coffee. Breakfast. Clean up. 10 a.m. Start dinner prep. Meat, potatoes, vegetables if they had them. Bread if there was time. Noon. Serve, clean up. 3 p.m. Start supper prep. 6 p.m. Serve, clean up. 8 p.m. Collapse. 4 a.m. Repeat. Margaret's hands developed new calluses. Her back adjusted to the constant standing. Her feet learned to ignore the ache. The men stopped watching her with suspicion and started watching her with something else. Not quite trust. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of it. She learned their names, their preferences. Who liked extra gravy? Who hated onions? who would eat anything put in front of him without complaint. Jack became an ally. He'd stop by mid-morning sometimes, ostensibly to discuss supplies, but really to check on her, make sure she wasn't drowning. "You're doing good," he said one afternoon, watching her knead bread dough. "Better than good. Men are actually complimenting the food now." "They should," Margaret said. "I'm working with scraps and they're eating like kings." Jack laughed. "That's what I told Thornhill. Said you're stretching ingredients better than anyone we've had." Margaret punched down the dough, shaped it into loaves. "Is that why he keeps watching me?" She'd noticed it over the past week. Thornhill would linger after meals, ostensibly reading a newspaper or going over paperwork, but his eyes would drift to the kitchen, to her. Jack's expression turned careful. "Boss is a private man. Lost his wife 5 years back, childbirth. Baby didn't make it either." Margaret's hands stilled. "I didn't know. Not many do. He don't talk about it." Jack shifted his weight. "But he takes his responsibilities serious. You're under his roof, working his ranch. He's probably just making sure you're settling in all right. Or making sure I don't run off like the others," Margaret said. "That too." The trouble started on a Tuesday. Margaret was pulling bread from the oven when she heard shouting from the yard. Male voices, angry. She moved to the window. Jimmy Carter stood in the middle of a circle of men, his face red, gesturing wildly. He was yelling at someone. A younger hand, newer than the others. Jack materialized next to her. "Damn it!" "What's happening?" Jimmy found out the new kid's been taking extra portions, sneaking back for seconds when no one's looking. Jack's jaw tightened. "Food's a serious thing out here, Miss Bellamy. When supplies are tight, stealing from the pot is like stealing from every man at the table." Margaret watched the confrontation escalate. The young hand, she thought his name was David, looked terrified. Jimmy looked ready to throw punches. Then Thornhill stepped into the circle. He didn't shout, didn't raise his voice, but every man went quiet. Margaret couldn't hear what he said, but she saw the effect. Jimmy backed down, still angry but controlled. David looked at the ground, shoulders hunched with shame. Thornhill spoke to them both. Brief, direct. Then he pointed toward the bunkhouse. The circle dissolved. Men returning to work. Crisis averted. But when Thornhill turned toward the cookhouse, his expression was troubled. He found Margaret in the kitchen. "May I speak with you?" "Of course." He took off his hat, turned it in his hands. "There's been some concern about food portions." Margaret stiffened. "I'm serving the same to everyone. No favorites." "I know, that's not—" He stopped, searched for words. "Some of the men think the portions are smaller than they used to be." "They are," Margaret said bluntly, "because Mrs. Brennan was wasting half of what she cooked, throwing out pounds of food every week. I don't waste. I measure. I portion. And I make sure there's enough for everyone without drowning in leftovers." Thornhill blinked. "You're rationing." "I'm being efficient." Margaret crossed her arms. "You hired me to cook for 30 men. I'm cooking for 30 men, but I'm not cooking for 35 just so 5 portions can rot in the yard." A long pause. Then Thornhill's mouth twitched. Almost a smile. "Jack said you were good at stretching supplies." "Jack's right. The men don't like change." "The men will adjust," Margaret said. "But if you want me to go back to Mrs. Brennan's way, cooking twice what's needed and throwing away the rest, then you better increase my supply budget by half." Thornhill studied her, that gray-eyed assessment she was getting used to. "Fair enough," he said finally. "I'll speak to the men. Make it clear this comes from me, not you." "It comes from common sense," Margaret corrected. "But if you want to take credit, be my guest." This time he did smile. Small, brief, but genuine. "You don't scare easy, do you, Miss Bellamy?" "No, sir," Margaret said. "I don't, none." That night, Thornhill addressed the men at supper. Margaret served while he spoke, keeping her head down, her movements efficient. "Some of you have concerns about portions," Thornhill said. His voice carried across the dining hall. "I want to make something clear. Miss Bellamy is following my instructions. We were wasting food before. Now we're not. Everyone gets fed, everyone gets enough, but there won't be excess. If you're still hungry after your plate, tell Miss Bellamy. She'll make sure you're taken care of, but we're not throwing away good food anymore. Understood?" Murmurs of acknowledgement. Anyone who has a problem with this can take it up with me directly. Thornhill's tone hardened. Not with Miss Bellamy. Not with each other. With me. The murmurs died completely. Margaret risked a glance at the tables. Most men looked chastened. A few looked thoughtful. Jimmy Carter looked angry, but he kept his mouth shut. The meal proceeded in tense silence. Afterward, as men filed out, a few stopped to speak to Margaret. "Dinner was good, ma'am." "Beef was tender. Gravy's better than we had before." Small things. But they mattered. Jack was the last to leave. He paused at the door. "You handled that well." "I didn't handle anything," Margaret said. "Mr. Thornhill did. You stood your ground when he asked. That's handling it." Jack tipped his hat. "Keep it up, Miss Bellamy. You're winning them over." Margaret wasn't sure about that. But as she washed dishes in the quiet cookhouse, she allowed herself a moment of cautious hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could make this work. The next morning brought rain. Not a gentle rain, but a deluge. The kind that turned the ranch yard into a mud pit and made every task 3 times harder. Margaret woke to water dripping through a crack in her ceiling. She positioned a bucket under it and dressed quickly, shivering in the cold. The cookhouse was freezing. The stove had gone out overnight, and the wood was damp. It took her 20 minutes to get a fire going, precious time she didn't have. By 6 a.m., she had coffee and biscuits ready, but no eggs, no meat. The chickens were huddled in their coop refusing to lay, and the smokehouse was across the yard, a journey that would soak her to the bone. The men arrived to a sparse breakfast. Jimmy Carter was the first to complain. "Where's the rest?" "In the smokehouse," Margaret said. "Feel free to get it yourself." He glared at her. "That's your job." "My job is cooking, not drowning." Margaret poured coffee. "Biscuits are hot. Coffee's strong. If you want more, there'll be more at dinner." "This is bullshit," Jimmy muttered. Several men shot him warning looks, but he ignored them. Margaret ignored him too. She'd learned quickly that men like Jimmy fed on attention, starved them of it, and they usually moved on. But Jimmy didn't move on. He spent the meal making comments, loud enough to hear, quiet enough to pretend he wasn't talking to her directly. "Cook can't even handle a little rain. Probably scared of getting her dress wet. Maybe we should get someone who can actually do the job." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she kept working, kept moving, kept her face neutral. Then Jimmy said, "Course, what'd we expect from a woman who couldn't even get herself a husband? Too fat, too ugly, too—" The slap cracked across the dining hall like thunder. Jimmy's head snapped to the side. His hand flew to his cheek, eyes wide with shock. Margaret stood over him, her hand still raised, her chest heaving. The entire hall went silent. No one moved. No one breathed. "Say that again," Margaret whispered. Her voice shook, not with fear, but with rage barely contained. "I dare you." Jimmy stared at her. His face was bright red, the outline of her hand already visible. For a moment, Margaret thought he might hit her back. Then Jack stood up, then another man, then another. Not threatening, not aggressive, just standing. A wall of silent support. Jimmy looked around at his fellow ranch hands, at the cold expressions and crossed arms, and whatever he saw there made him think better of whatever he'd been about to do. He shoved back from the table and stalked out, slamming the door behind him. The rain seemed louder in his absence. Margaret lowered her hand slowly. It was shaking. Her whole body was shaking. "Miss Bellamy," Jack said quietly. "You all right?" She nodded, couldn't speak. If she tried, she'd either scream or cry, and she refused to do either in front of these men. "Jimmy's always been a hothead," someone said. "Boss'll sort him out." "Shouldn't have said those things," another added. "Damn right he shouldn't have." Margaret turned away, back to the kitchen, back to the stove. Her hands found work automatically, cleaning, organizing, moving. Anything to stop the shaking. Behind her, the men resumed eating, quieter now, subdued. But when they left, each one made a point to thank her for breakfast, even with so little to work with, even after what had happened, especially after what had happened. Thornhill came to the cookhouse an hour later. Margaret was kneading dough for dinner rolls, her hands moving with mechanical precision. She heard him enter but didn't look up. "Miss Bellamy." "Mr. Thornhill." A pause. "I heard about what happened at breakfast." "I'm sure you did." Another pause, longer this time. "Did he hurt you?" "No." "No." Margaret punched the dough harder than necessary. But he insulted me in front of everyone, said things that... Her voice cracked. She stopped, furious at herself. I know what he said. Thornhill's tone was gentle. Jack told me. Then you know I had cause to hit him. I'm not disputing that. Margaret finally looked up. Thornhill stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his expression troubled but not angry. I sent Jimmy to work the north fence, he said. Alone, in the rain. He'll be out there all day, all week if I feel like it. By the time he comes back, he'll know better than to disrespect you again. Will he? Margaret's laugh was bitter. Or will he just hate me more? I don't care if he hates you, Thornhill said flatly. I care that he respects you. And if he can't manage that, he can find work somewhere else. Margaret stared at him. You'd fire him? Over this? Over this, Thornhill confirmed. I told you when you arrived. I run a clean operation. No rough behavior. That includes rough words. He stepped further into the kitchen. You're under my protection here, Miss Bellamy. I take that seriously. I don't need protection, Margaret said. I can handle men like Jimmy. You already proved that. Almost a smile. Half the ranch is talking about how you laid him flat with one slap. I think you earned some respect this morning. Or made an enemy. Maybe both. Thornhill set his hat on the table. Truth is, some men won't respect you no matter what you do. Jimmy might be one of them. But the others? They saw you stand up for yourself. They saw you refuse to back down. That matters out here. Margaret turned back to the dough. Your men don't like me. Some of them don't know what to make of you, Thornhill corrected. You're not like the other cooks we've had. You're younger, stronger. You don't take their nonsense. He paused. You're also a woman, and most of these men haven't lived around a woman in years. They're awkward, uncertain. But that's not the same as dislike. Feels the same from where I'm standing. I imagine it does. Thornhill picked up his hat again. For what it's worth, Miss Bellamy, you're the best cook this ranch has seen. The men know it, even if they won't say it. And I know it. Margaret's hand stilled on the dough. The offer stands, Thornhill continued. If anyone gives you trouble, any kind of trouble, you come to me. Understood? She nodded, didn't trust herself to speak. Thornhill left as quietly as he'd come. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, hands covered in flour, rain drumming on the roof, and for the first time since arriving at Thornhill Ranch, she let herself cry. Not from sadness, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of being believed, of being defended, of mattering to someone, even if only as an employee. She cried for 5 minutes. Then she washed her face, rolled out the dough, and got back to work. Because whatever else happened, the men still needed to eat at noon. And Margaret Bellamy didn't quit. Jimmy Carter didn't come back to the cookhouse for 3 days. Margaret noticed his absence the way you notice a splinter being removed. Sudden relief, then the dull awareness that the wound is still there. The other men ate with less tension in their shoulders. Conversations resumed. Someone even laughed at breakfast on the second day, a sound so unexpected that Margaret dropped a ladle. But she knew Jimmy would return eventually. Men like him always did. On the 4th day, he appeared at dinner. His clothes were caked with mud, his face windburned and exhausted. He took his usual seat without looking at her, without speaking to anyone. Jack had put him next to the older hands, the ones who didn't tolerate nonsense. Margaret served him the same portion as everyone else. Their eyes met briefly as she set down his plate. He looked away first. Small victories, Margaret thought. She'd take them where she could find them. The meal passed without incident. Jimmy ate in silence, cleaned his plate, and left with the others. No comments. No insults. Just compliance. Jack lingered after the others had gone. Boss worked him hard, he said, gathering empty cups. Had him restringing fence in the rain for 12 hours straight. No breaks except to water the horse. Good, Margaret said. Jimmy's not a bad hand when he keeps his mouth shut. Young, stupid, but he learns. Jack paused. He's also scared of you now. Margaret snorted. Scared of me? You hit him in front of the whole crew, made him look small. Jack's expression was serious. That's not something a man like Jimmy forgets. He'll either respect you for it or hate you twice as hard. No middle ground. Which do you think it'll be? Jack considered this. Depends on what you do next. If you rub it in, lord it over him, he'll hate you. If you treat him normal, same as the others, he might come around. So I'm supposed to pretend it never happened? No, you're supposed to show him you're bigger than he is, not in size, Jack added quickly, seeing her expression. In character. Margaret turned back to the dishes. I'll think about it. But she already knew what she'd do, the same thing she always did. Keep her head down, do her job, and refuse to give anyone power over her emotions. It had worked for 20 years in town. It would work here too. The rain broke on the 5th day, giving way to brilliant sunshine that turned the mud into steam. Margaret woke before dawn as always, but instead of the usual gloom, golden light streamed through her small window. She dressed quickly and stepped outside. The ranch yard was already alive with activity, men moving horses, repairing damage from the storm, calling to each other across the distance. The air smelled clean, like wet earth and possibility. For the first time since arriving, Margaret felt something other than exhaustion. She felt useful. The cookhouse was warm from last night's banked coals. Margaret built up the fire, set coffee to brew, and began breakfast with something close to contentment. Her hands knew the work now. The measurements, the timing, the rhythm of feeding 30 men who burned calories like firewood. She was pulling biscuits from the oven when she heard a child's voice. Margaret froze. Children didn't belong on Thornhill Ranch. Thornhill had made that clear when she arrived. No families, no wives, no distractions. Just work and men and the endless cycle of cattle. She moved to the window. A girl stood in the yard, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a dress that was too big and boots that were too small. She had dark hair in 2 braids and was clutching a cloth bundle to her chest. Behind her stood a woman Margaret didn't recognize, thin, harried-looking, wringing her hands. Thornhill emerged from the main house, his face tight with displeasure. He said something Margaret couldn't hear. The woman responded, gesturing to the child. Thornhill's expression didn't soften, but he crouched down to the girl's level, spoke to her directly. The girl nodded, said something, held out the bundle. Thornhill took it, his movements careful. Then the woman kissed the girl's forehead and walked away. Just walked away, toward the road, her shoulders shaking. The girl watched her go without crying, without calling out, just standing there in the yard like a small statue. Margaret's chest tightened. Thornhill straightened, one hand on the girl's shoulder. He looked around the yard, at his men pretending not to notice, at the cookhouse where smoke rose from the chimney. His eyes found the window, found Margaret. He said something to the girl and led her toward the cookhouse. Margaret stepped back from the window, her mind racing. A child. Here, why? Who was that woman? Where was she going? The door opened. Miss Bellamy, Thornhill said. His voice was strained. This is Emma. She'll be staying with us for a while. Up close, the girl was painfully thin. Her dress hung on her like a sack, and her eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much, too young. She stared at Margaret without expression. Hello, Emma, Margaret said softly. The girl didn't respond. Thornhill's jaw tightened. Her mother just left her here. Said she can't care for her anymore, that she's going to St. Louis to find work. He spoke the words like they tasted bad. I told her this isn't a charity house, but she, He stopped, looked down at Emma. She left anyway. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. Where's her father? Dead, 6 months ago. Pneumonia. Other family? Mother claims there's none. Emma's eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Her hands clutched the bundle, which Margaret now saw was a small blanket, worn thin with washing. She can't stay in the bunkhouse, Thornhill said. And I don't have anywhere for a child in the main house. It's not suitable. He looked at Margaret with something close to desperation. I was hoping you might take her in, Margaret finished. Just temporarily, until I can find proper placement. An orphanage in town, or a family willing to... An orphanage, Margaret repeated flatly. Thornhill had the grace to look uncomfortable. I'm not equipped to raise a child. This is a working ranch. We're out before dawn, in after dark. There's no schooling, no... How long was her mother here? Maybe 10 minutes. She wouldn't come inside. Just brought Emma to the gate and started talking fast, like if she slowed down she'd change her mind. Thornhill's hand tightened on Emma's shoulder. I tried to give her money, for train fare back at least. She wouldn't take it. Margaret crouched down to Emma's level. The girl's eyes flickered to her face, then away. Are you hungry, Emma? A tiny nod. I'm making biscuits. Do you like biscuits? Another nod. Then come on. You can help me. Margaret stood and extended her hand. Emma looked at the hand like it might bite. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. Her fingers were ice cold. Thornhill exhaled. Thank you, Miss Bellamy. I'll speak to the sheriff today. See what can be arranged. You do that, Margaret said. She led Emma toward the kitchen, feeling the girl's grip tighten with each step. Behind them, Thornhill left without another word. Emma sat at the work table while Margaret finished breakfast. She didn't speak, didn't move unless directed. When Margaret gave her a biscuit with butter, she ate it in tiny bites, making it last as long as possible. When did you eat last? Margaret asked gently. Emma swallowed. Yesterday. Maybe. Maybe? Mama kept saying we'd eat after she found work. But she never found work. Just talked to men who said no. Emma's voice was thin, hollow. Then she said she knew a place, a ranch, said the man there owed her a favor. Margaret's hand stilled on the dough she was shaping. Did he? Owe her a favor? I don't think so. He looked at her like she was lying. Emma took another bite. Mama lies sometimes, when she's scared. The matter-of-fact way she said it broke Margaret's heart. The men arrived for breakfast and stopped short at the sight of Emma. The girl shrank against the wall, trying to make herself invisible. We got a visitor? Jack asked carefully. This is Emma, Margaret said. She's staying here for a bit. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with Mr. Thornhill. Jack looked at Emma, then at Margaret, and seemed to understand something unspoken. No problem here, welcome, Emma. The other men echoed the sentiment, though most looked deeply uncomfortable. They were used to cattle and horses. A small, traumatized child was entirely outside their expertise. Jimmy Carter was the last to enter. He saw Emma and froze. Margaret tensed, ready to intervene if he said anything cruel, but Jimmy just stared at the girl for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he took his seat without comment. The meal was quieter than usual. Men ate quickly, darting glances at Emma, who hadn't moved from her spot against the wall. When they finished, they left their dishes more neatly than normal, as if trying to be on their best behavior. After they'd gone, Margaret pulled out a crate and lined it with clean towels. You look exhausted, honey. Why don't you rest here while I clean up? Emma climbed into the makeshift bed without argument. She was asleep in seconds, curled around her blanket like it was the only thing anchoring her to the world. Margaret worked quietly, watching the girl sleep. Her mind churned with questions. What kind of mother abandoned her child at a strange ranch? What desperation drove someone to that point? And what was Thornhill going to do when the sheriff inevitably said the orphanage was full? Because Margaret had known the moment she saw Emma's face, that orphanages were always full, especially with older children, especially with girls who were too thin and too quiet and too clearly damaged. Emma would end up in a workhouse, or worse. Margaret scrubbed a pot with unnecessary force. By noon, Emma was awake and trailing Margaret like a shadow. She didn't ask questions, didn't request anything, just watched with those enormous, wary eyes. Can you peel potatoes? Margaret asked. Emma nodded. Margaret set her up with a bucket and a knife, expecting slow, clumsy work. But Emma's hands moved with practiced efficiency, the peels coming off in long, even strips. She'd done this before, many times. Your mama taught you to cook? Mama worked in a boarding house kitchen before Papa died. Emma's hands never stopped moving. I helped her, peeling, washing, fetching things. She must have been a good cook. She was all right. The men complained sometimes, but they always ate everything. Emma paused. Then Papa got sick, and Mama had to stay home to take care of him. They fired her, said they couldn't wait for her to come back. Margaret felt anger rise in her throat. That wasn't fair. Lots of things aren't fair. Emma returned to peeling. That's what Papa said before he died. He said life isn't fair, but you got to keep going anyway. Your Papa was right. He usually was. Emma's voice was very small. I miss him. I bet you do, honey. They worked in silence after that. Margaret prepared meat for stew while Emma finished the potatoes, then moved on to carrots. The girl worked with the exhausted efficiency of someone twice her age. Thornhill returned just before dinner. He looked haggard, like the trip to town had drained something from him. "The orphanage is full," he said without preamble. "Has been for months. They said they can put Emma on a waiting list, but it could be 6 months before space opens up." 6 months, Margaret repeated. "The sheriff suggested a workhouse, but I told him that wasn't acceptable." Thornhill rubbed his face. "There's a family 20 miles south that sometimes takes in children. I sent word. They'll respond in a few days." Emma, who'd been setting the table, went very still. "And if they say no?" Margaret asked. "Then I'll keep looking." Thornhill's eyes found Emma. "I'm not sending you to a workhouse. I promise." Emma didn't respond. Didn't look at him. Just continued setting out plates with mechanical precision. Dinner was tense. The men were on their best behavior again, which somehow made everything worse. Too polite. Too careful. Like they were all walking on eggshells around this silent, hollow-eyed child. Halfway through the meal, one of the younger hands, a boy named Peter who couldn't be more than 18, tried to make conversation. "You ever seen a horse up close, Emma?" Emma shook her head. "We got some real pretty ones here. Gentle, too. Maybe Miss Bellamy would let you come see them sometime." Emma looked at Margaret. "If you want to," Margaret said. Emma considered this. "All right." It was the first thing she'd agreed to all day. Peter brightened. "Tomorrow morning, then. Before breakfast. I'll show you the best ones." For the first time, something flickered across Emma's face. Not quite a smile, but close. Interest, maybe. Or hope. Margaret caught Thornhill watching the exchange, his expression unreadable. After the men left, Emma helped Margaret clean up without being asked. She washed dishes in a basin while Margaret dried and put them away. They developed a rhythm: pass, dry, stack. Pass, dry, stack. "Miss Bellamy?" Emma said quietly. "Yes, honey." "Are you going to send me away too?" Margaret's hand stilled on the plate she was drying. She turned to look at Emma, really look at her, this small, scared girl who'd been abandoned by the one person who should have protected her. "No," Margaret said, "I'm not." But Mr. Thornhill said, "Mr. Thornhill is trying to find you a good home, a proper home with a family." Margaret crouched down. "But while you're here, you're safe. You understand me? You're safe." Emma's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back fiercely, her jaw tight. "It's all right to cry," Margaret said gently. "Crying doesn't help." Emma's voice was fierce. "Mama cried all the time after Papa died. It didn't bring him back. It didn't make things better. It just made her face red and her eyes hurt." Margaret recognized that tone, that hardness. She developed it herself years ago when she realized tears only made people uncomfortable. "Sometimes crying isn't about making things better," Margaret said. "Sometimes it's just about getting through the next hour." Emma stared at her. Then very slowly, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Margaret's waist. Margaret hugged her back, feeling the girl's thin shoulders shake with silent sobs. They stayed like that for a long time. That night, Margaret gave Emma her bed and made herself a pallet on the floor. Emma protested weakly, but exhaustion won out. She was asleep before Margaret finished spreading blankets. Margaret lay awake in the darkness, listening to Emma's breathing. The girl made small sounds in her sleep, whimpers, half words. Nightmares, probably. What kind of woman abandoned her child? But even as Margaret thought it, she knew the answer. A desperate one. A broken one. A woman who saw no other choice in a world that offered precious few choices to begin with. Margaret had been lucky. Thomas had kept them afloat after their parents died, had found her this position, had given her a chance. But what if he hadn't? What if she'd been alone with a child to care for and no prospects? She might have made the same choice Emma's mother had. The thought kept her awake until dawn. Emma kept her promise to Peter. At 5:30 in the morning, still dark outside, she appeared in the kitchen dressed and ready. "The horses," she said. "He said before breakfast." Margaret smiled. "Go on then, but stay close to Peter. Don't wander off." Emma nodded and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. Margaret watched through the window as Peter led Emma toward the corrals, talking animatedly, gesturing at different horses. Emma walked beside him, her posture less rigid than yesterday. Maybe this place could be good for her. Temporarily, at least. Margaret was mixing biscuit dough when she heard shouting. She ran to the window. Emma stood in the middle of the corral, frozen, while a massive bay horse charged straight at her. Peter was scrambling over the fence, yelling something Margaret couldn't hear. Margaret dropped the spoon and ran. She cleared the cookhouse door, crossed the yard, her skirts tangling around her legs. Too slow. Too far. The horse bore down on Emma, who stood paralyzed with fear. Then a figure vaulted the fence and grabbed Emma, rolling them both out of the way just as the horse thundered past. They tumbled in the dirt, a tangle of limbs and dust. Margaret reached the corral as Thornhill sat up, still holding Emma. The girl was screaming now, terror finally breaking through her composure. "I got you," Thornhill said. You're all right. I got you." Peter reached them, white-faced. "I'm sorry, boss. I didn't know Zeus was loose. He must have gotten out of his stall and—" "Later," Thornhill said. He stood, lifting Emma with him. She clung to his neck, her screams fading to gasps. Margaret took Emma from him, feeling the girl's heart racing like a trapped bird. "You're safe. You're safe now." Emma buried her face in Margaret's shoulder. Thornhill stood there, covered in dirt, breathing hard. His eyes met Margaret's over Emma's head. "Thank you," Margaret said. He nodded. Then he turned to Peter. "Secure that horse, now, and find out how he got loose." Peter ran off. Margaret carried Emma back to the cookhouse, murmuring reassurances the whole way. Behind them, she could hear Thornhill calming the agitated horse, his voice low and steady. Inside, Margaret set Emma on the work table and checked her over. No injuries, just fear. "I froze," Emma whispered. "Papa always said never freeze around animals, but I froze anyway." "You were scared. That's normal." "Normal gets you killed on a ranch," Emma's voice was bitter. "I'm useless here." "You are not useless." Margaret gripped the girl's shoulders. "You're 8 years old. You're not supposed to know everything about ranches and horses. You're supposed to be a child." "Children are burdens," Emma said. "That's what Mama said. She said I was the reason she couldn't work, couldn't move on, couldn't—" She stopped, swallowed hard. Margaret felt rage boil in her chest. Not at Emma, at the mother who'd planted these poison seeds in her daughter's mind. "Your mother was wrong," Margaret said firmly. "You are not a burden. You hear me?" Emma's eyes filled with tears again. "You're not a burden," Margaret repeated. "Not to me, not to anyone here." The door opened. Thornhill stepped in, still covered in dust. He looked at Emma, then at Margaret. "Zeus is secure. Peter feels terrible." He paused. "Emma, I need you to understand something. What happened out there wasn't your fault. That horse has a temper. He shouldn't have been in the main corral. That's on us, not you." Emma wiped her eyes. "I should have moved. You were scared. Fear makes people freeze. It's not weakness, it's biology." Thornhill pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. "First time I saw my father get thrown by a horse, I froze too. I was your age. He broke his arm, and I just stood there like a fence post." Emma looked at him with surprise. "Everybody freezes sometimes," Thornhill continued. "What matters is what you do after. You can let it stop you from trying again, or you can learn from it." He met Emma's eyes. "Your choice." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I still want to see the horses. The gentle ones." Thornhill almost smiled. "Tomorrow, I'll take you myself, show you the ones that won't spook." Emma nodded. "Now," Thornhill said, standing, "I need to wash this dirt off before breakfast. Emma, you stay with Miss Bellamy. Don't wander off alone until you know the ranch better, understood?" "Yes, sir." He left, and Margaret returned to making biscuits with Emma's help. The girl was quieter than before, more thoughtful. But when the men arrived for breakfast, she didn't hide. She sat at the end of one table and ate her portion with them. Progress. The next 3 days settled into a routine. Emma helped Margaret in the kitchen, learning as she worked. She was quick, observant, and startlingly competent for her age. Margaret found herself actually enjoying the company, something she hadn't expected. Thornhill kept his promise. Every morning he spent an hour with Emma in the corrals, teaching her about horses. How to approach them, how to read their moods, how to earn their trust. Emma absorbed it all, like dry earth absorbing rain. The men, for their part, adjusted to having a child around. Some ignored her. Others went out of their way to be kind, saving choice bits of meat for her plate, fixing a wobbly chair she'd been using, teaching her to tie knots with spare rope. Even Jimmy Carter softened. Margaret caught him showing Emma how to whistle one afternoon, patient and gentle in a way she'd never seen from him. People were complicated. Margaret was learning that more every day. On the fourth day, a writer arrived with a letter. The family 20 miles south had responded to Thornhill's inquiry. They already had 4 children. They couldn't take another. Thornhill read the letter in the cookhouse doorway, his face grim. Emma watched him from the work table, her hand still on the carrots she'd been chopping. "They said no," Emma said. "Not a question." "They're already stretched thin," Thornhill said. It's fine." Emma returned to chopping. "I understand." But her hands shook slightly. Thornhill looked at Margaret. She saw the question in his eyes, the same one that had been growing in her own mind for days. "What now?" "I'll keep looking," Thornhill said finally. "There are other families, other options." "Sure," Emma said. Her voice was flat. Thornhill left, looking defeated. Margaret moved to stand beside Emma. "You all right?" "Nobody wants me." Emma's knife moved precisely, methodically. "Mama didn't want me. That family doesn't want me. The orphanage is full. Her voice cracked. "I'm just in the way everywhere." "You're not in the way here. You're being paid to feed people. I'm just one more mouth." "Emma?" Margaret took the knife gently from her hands and set it aside. "Look at me." The girl looked up, her eyes red but dry. "I'm going to tell you something true," Margaret said. "You're right that I'm being paid to cook, but that's not why I let you help me. That's not why I gave you my bed. And that's not why I want you to stay." "Then why?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "Because when I look at you, I see myself. The girl nobody wanted, the one who didn't fit anywhere. And I know what that feels like, to believe you're a burden just by existing." She cupped Emma's face gently. "But you're not a burden to me. You're company, you're help. You're someone who makes this kitchen less lonely." Emma's bottom lip trembled. "Really? Really? But Mr. Thornhill said—" "Mr. Thornhill is trying to do right by you, find you a real family, a proper home." Margaret paused. "But if those things don't work out, you have a place here, with me, for as long as you need it." Emma stared at her. "You mean it?" "I mean it." The girl launched herself into Margaret's arms, holding on like she was drowning, and Margaret was the only solid thing in the world. Margaret held her tight and made a decision. Emma was staying, no matter what Thornhill said, no matter what the town thought, no matter what it cost, because some things mattered more than reputation. Some things mattered more than fear. And this child, this scared, abandoned, impossibly brave child, mattered most of all. Margaret told Thornhill her decision that evening after Emma had gone to bed, and the cookhouse was quiet except for the settling fire. He'd come by to discuss supplies for the next week, ledger in hand, but Margaret cut straight through the pleasantries. "Emma's staying with me," she said. Thornhill looked up from his notes. "I'm still making inquiries. There's a pastor's wife and—" "I don't care." Margaret's voice was steady. "She's staying, here, with me. Miss Bellamy, you don't understand what you're offering. A child is a responsibility that—" "I understand perfectly." Margaret crossed her arms. "I also understand that you've been looking for 2 weeks and come up empty. The orphanage is full. The workhouse is out of the question. Every family you've contacted has said no. How many more rejections does that little girl need to endure before we admit there's no magical solution coming?" Thornhill set down his ledger. "This isn't a suitable environment for raising a child. We're a working ranch. There's no school, no other children, no what? No proper family?" Margaret's laugh was sharp. "Emma doesn't have a proper family. Her mother abandoned her and her father's dead. What she has is me, this cookhouse, and 30 ranch hands who are doing their best not to scare her. It's not perfect, but it's what we've got. The town will talk. The town already talks. About me, about you, about everything that happens on this ranch." Margaret stepped closer. "You know what they're saying, don't you? That I'm your mistress, that we're living in sin, that a woman like me has no business being around decent men." Thornhill's jaw tightened. "I've heard the rumors." "Then one more won't make a difference. Let them say I'm raising a child out of wedlock. Let them say whatever they want. I stopped caring what this town thinks of me a long time ago. But I care, Thornhill said quietly, about your reputation, about Emma's future, about whether we're doing right by her. Right by her? Margaret's voice rose. Right by her would have been her mother keeping her. Failing that, right by her is making sure she doesn't end up in a workhouse or on the street. Everything else is just details. They stared at each other across the kitchen. Thornhill looked tired, Margaret realized. Not just physically tired, but worn down by the weight of trying to solve a problem that had no clean solution. "What about when she's older?" he asked. "When she needs schooling, friends her own age, a woman to teach her things a man can't." "I'm a woman. You know what I mean." "No, I don't think I do." Margaret's tone cooled. "Are you saying I'm not capable of raising her properly because I'm unmarried, because I'm a cook?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Thornhill rubbed his face. "I meant that Emma deserves more than what we can give her here. A real home, a real family, a real chance at a normal life. And I'm telling you, she won't get those things anywhere else." Margaret's voice gentled slightly. "Look, I'm not saying this is perfect. I'm saying it's the best option we have. Emma's already settling in. She's helping in the kitchen, learning about the ranch, starting to trust people again. If we uproot her now, send her to strangers who might or might not treat her well, we'll undo all of that. Or we'll give her a chance at something better. Or we'll break her completely." Margaret held his gaze. "I know what it's like to be passed around like an unwanted package. To be the burden nobody wants to carry. It destroys something in you, makes you believe you're worthless. Is that what you want for Emma?" Thornhill was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "That's the last thing I want." "Then let her stay, please." He studied her face, and Margaret saw the moment he made his decision. His shoulders dropped slightly, tension releasing. "All right," he said. "She can stay. Temporarily. We'll revisit this in 6 months, see how she's doing. If it's not working, if she's unhappy or struggling, we explore other options. Agreed?" "Agreed," Margaret said, even though she had no intention of letting Emma go in 6 months or ever. Thornhill picked up his ledger. "I'll add her to the household accounts. She'll need clothes, shoes, winter gear. Write down what she needs, and I'll have it sent from town." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." He moved toward the door, then paused. "The town social is in 3 weeks. Saturday night. Everyone attends. Ranchers, families, businessmen. It's expected." Margaret's stomach dropped. "I don't go to socials." "You do now. You're part of this ranch, which means you represent Thornhill Ranch. People will expect to see you." His tone was firm. "And they'll expect to see Emma. If we're doing this, raising her here, we need to show the town she's cared for. Well-fed, well-dressed, presentable. Otherwise the rumors will get worse." "I don't care about rumors. Maybe you should." Thornhill's eyes were serious. "Because if the wrong person decides Emma's not being properly cared for, they can involve the law. Get her taken away and placed wherever they see fit. Is that what you want?" Margaret felt cold. "They can do that?" "They can try, especially if there's talk about impropriety or neglect." He adjusted his hat. "So we go to the social, we show our faces, we prove the rumors wrong. Understood?" Margaret wanted to argue, to say she'd rather face down a charging bull than a room full of judgmental townspeople. But she thought of Emma, asleep in the next room, finally starting to feel safe. "Understood," she said. After Thornhill left, Margaret sat at the work table and put her head in her hands. A town social. 3 weeks. She hadn't attended one since before her parents died, back when her mother would force her into uncomfortable dresses and parade her around like a prize sow at auction. Nothing good had ever come from those events. Just whispers and pitying looks, and young men who'd draw straws to see who had to ask her to dance as a joke. She'd rather scrub every pot in the territory with a toothbrush. But for Emma, she'd do it. The next morning, Margaret told Emma about the social over breakfast. The girl's reaction was immediate and visceral. "I don't want to go." "Neither do I," Margaret admitted. "But Mr. Thornhill says we need to. It's important." "Why?" "Because people need to see you're being taken care of properly. That you're happy here." Emma's expression turned shrewd beyond her years. "You mean they need to see you're not a bad person for keeping me?" Margaret blinked. "Where did you hear that?" "I hear things. Men talk when they think I'm not listening. Emma pushed food around her plate. They say the town thinks you're Mr. Thornhill's woman, that it's improper, that now with me here it's even worse. Emma, is it true? Are you his woman? No, Margaret said firmly. I'm his employee, nothing more. But people think all sorts of things, most of them wrong. Margaret reached across and stilled Emma's restless hands. Listen to me. What matters isn't what people think. It's what's true. And the truth is, you're safe here. I'm doing my job here. Everything else is just noise. Then why do we have to go to the social? Because sometimes you have to face the noise head on. Prove it wrong. Margaret squeezed Emma's hand. I won't let anyone hurt you, I promise. Emma looked uncertain, but nodded. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of work and worry. Margaret taught Emma more advanced cooking techniques, how to judge meat doneness by touch, how to make gravy without lumps, how to stretch supplies when money was tight. The girl absorbed everything with fierce concentration, like she was memorizing survival skills. Which, Margaret supposed, she was. Thornhill kept his distance, but checked in regularly. Margaret noticed he'd started lingering at meals, watching Emma interact with the ranch hands. The girl had developed favorites: Jack, who told her stories about wild horses; Peter, who taught her to rope fence posts; and surprisingly, Jimmy Carter, who'd become something like a protective older brother. You see that? Jack said one afternoon, nodding toward Jimmy and Emma in the yard. Jimmy was showing her how to mend a bridle, patient and focused. I see it, Margaret said. Hard to believe that's the same man who called me fat and useless a month ago. People surprise you sometimes. Jack leaned against the doorframe. Jimmy's not a bad sort, just young and stupid and full of anger he don't know what to do with. Having Emma around, having someone smaller to protect, it's giving him purpose beyond being the loudest voice in the room. You think he's actually changing, or just performing? Does it matter if the result's the same? Jack asked. He treats Emma with respect, treats you with respect now too. Whatever his reasons, I'll take it. Margaret supposed he had a point. The package from town arrived on a Tuesday. 3 dresses for Emma, new boots, a warm coat, stockings, and a hairbrush with a matching ribbon. Margaret opened it in the cookhouse with Emma hovering nearby. These are for me? Emma touched the fabric reverently. All yours. Try them on. Make sure they fit. The dresses fit reasonably well, though one needed taking in at the waist. Margaret spent that evening by lamplight, making alterations while Emma watched. My mama used to sew, Emma said quietly. Before Papa died, she'd make dresses for the ladies in town. Beautiful things with lace and buttons. She was good at it. What happened? After Papa got sick, her hands started shaking. She couldn't make the small stitches anymore, kept pricking her fingers, staining the fabric with blood. Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes were distant. The ladies stopped hiring her, said her work wasn't good enough anymore. Margaret kept sewing, giving Emma space to talk. She tried other things, washing, cooking, cleaning houses, but she was always so tired, and sometimes she'd just start crying for no reason. Emma picked at a thread on her skirt. The last few weeks she stopped trying, just sat in our room staring at nothing. I had to remind her to eat. That must have been scary. It was. Emma's voice cracked. I kept thinking if I was better, if I helped more, complained less, needed less, maybe she'd be happy again. But nothing I did mattered. She just got sadder and sadder until one day she said we were going to that ranch and I'd have a better life there. Margaret set down her sewing. Emma, look at me. The girl met her eyes. Your mother's sadness wasn't your fault. You understand? Sometimes grief breaks people in ways they can't fix, no matter how hard their children try to help them. Margaret's throat tightened. What she did, leaving you, it was wrong. But it came from her broken places, not from anything you did or didn't do. She said I'd be better off without her. Maybe she believed that. Maybe she was even right in her own damaged way. Margaret reached for Emma's hand. But that doesn't mean you weren't worth keeping. It means she couldn't see her own worth, and that spilled over onto you. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then, do you think she misses me? I think she probably misses you every single day. And I think that missing probably hurts so much she can barely breathe. Margaret squeezed her hand. But missing you doesn't mean she was capable of caring for you. Those are 2 different things. Emma nodded slowly, processing. Then she leaned against Margaret's shoulder, and they sat like that until the lamp burned low. The day of the social arrived cold and bright. Margaret woke with her stomach in knots and the overwhelming urge to fake illness. But Emma appeared in her doorway at dawn, already dressed in her new blue dress, hair braided neatly. "I'm ready," she announced. So much for backing out. They spent the morning preparing food to bring. Ranch hospitality demanded it. Margaret made 3 pies, 2 dozen biscuits, and a roasted chicken. Simple food, but well executed. Nothing fancy enough to seem like she was showing off. Thornhill appeared at 4 o'clock in a clean shirt and brushed coat. He'd shaved recently, and his hair was combed back. Margaret had never seen him look so formal. "Ladies," he said, "the wagon's ready." Margaret looked down at her own dress. The same one she'd worn to arrive at the ranch months ago, let out again to accommodate her. It was clean, but shabby. She felt like a fraud playing dress-up. Emma took her hand. "You look nice, Miss Margaret." Margaret squeezed back. "So do you, honey." The ride to town took 40 minutes. Emma sat between Margaret and Thornhill, bouncing slightly with nervous energy. The closer they got, the tighter Margaret's chest became. "Remember," Thornhill said as they approached the town hall, "we're representing the ranch. Be polite, be present. Don't engage with anyone who's rude." "What if they are rude?" Emma asked. "Then you smile and walk away. Don't give them ammunition." The town hall was already crowded when they arrived. Families milled around outside, children running and shrieking. Inside, tables groaned under the weight of contributed food. A fiddle player was tuning up in the corner. Margaret's arrival drew immediate attention. She felt the eyes on her, assessing, judging, finding her wanting. Whispers started up like a brush fire. She recognized some faces from her childhood. Mrs. Henderson, who'd shouted about loose women. Mr. Patterson from the general store. The banker's wife, whose name Margaret had never learned, but whose condescending smile she'd never forgotten. Emma pressed closer to Margaret's side. "Head up," Thornhill murmured. "Show them you belong here." They made their way to the food tables. Margaret set down her contributions, acutely aware of being watched. Other women's offerings surrounded hers, elaborate cakes, decorated cookies, dishes that screamed hours of preparation. Her simple pies looked pathetic in comparison. "Margaret Bellamy," a voice said behind her. "As I live and breathe." Margaret turned to find Constance Miller, who'd been 2 years ahead of her in school. Constance had married well, a merchant from the next county, and wore her success like armor. "Constance," Margaret said evenly, "I heard you were cooking at Thornhill Ranch. 30 men, is it?" Constance's smile didn't reach her eyes. "That must be quite challenging." "It keeps me busy." "I'm sure it does." Constance's gaze dropped to Emma. "And who's this darling child?" "Emma," Margaret said. "She's staying at the ranch." "How charitable of Mr. Thornhill." Constance's tone suggested it was anything but charitable. "Taking in strays, is he? First you, now a child. He always did have a soft heart." Margaret felt Emma stiffen beside her. "Emma's not a stray, she's— Oh, I'm sure she's well cared for." Constance interrupted smoothly. "Living out there with all those men must be quite an education for her." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Thornhill materialized beside them. "Mrs. Miller," he said coolly, "how's your husband's business? I heard he had some trouble with that shipment from Denver." Constance's smile faltered. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Don't you?" "Strange, the whole territory's been talking about it." Thornhill's tone was pleasant, but his eyes were hard. "Excuse us. I see the pastor waving." He guided Margaret and Emma away before Constance could respond. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. "Don't thank me. That woman's been spreading poison since we arrived." Thornhill nodded toward a cluster of men near the wall. "I need to speak with the other ranchers. Business. Will you be all right?" Margaret wanted to say no, to beg him not to leave them alone in this den of vipers, but she forced herself to nod. "We'll be fine." Thornhill headed toward the men, leaving Margaret and Emma standing awkwardly near the food tables. "I don't like her," Emma whispered. "Neither do I, honey." They found seats along the wall and tried to be invisible. It didn't work. Women kept drifting past, their conversations clearly meant to be overheard. Raising that child in a bunkhouse, practically. No proper supervision, No female influence except that woman. I heard Callum Thornhill proposed marriage and she refused. Can you imagine? Margaret's head snapped up. That last comment came from a woman she didn't recognize. Young, pretty, with elaborate ringlets. Where did you hear that? Margaret asked sharply. The woman looked startled at being directly addressed. It's just what people are saying. People are wrong. Margaret stood. Mr. Thornhill has never proposed to me. He's my employer, nothing more. But surely you must have hoped. I hoped for steady work and fair pay. That's all. Margaret's voice carried across the room. If people are bored enough to invent romances where none exist, that says more about them than it does about me. The room had gone quiet. Everyone was watching now. The pretty woman flushed. I didn't mean to offend. Yes, you did. Own it. Margaret picked up Emma's hand. Come on, honey. Let's get some air. They walked out of the hall into the cool evening, Margaret's heart pounding. She'd just made a scene. Exactly what Thornhill had told her not to do. Miss Margaret? Emma's voice was small. Did Mr. Thornhill really propose to you? No, that's just gossip. But what if he did? Would you say yes? Margaret looked down at Emma's upturned face. Why are you asking? Because if you married him, we could stay together, forever. You'd be his wife and I'd be… I don't know. But we'd all be a family. Margaret's chest ached. Emma, that's not how it works. People don't get married just to keep children around. Why not? Seems like a good reason to me. Before Margaret could answer, Thornhill appeared in the doorway. Everything all right? Fine, Margaret lied. I heard you shut down the gossip about us. He almost smiled. Half the room looked terrified. I shouldn't have lost my temper. Maybe not, but I can't say I'm sorry you did. Thornhill glanced back at the hall. They're starting the dancing soon. You should come back inside. Show them you're not intimidated. I am intimidated. Then fake it. He offered his arm to Emma. What do you say, Miss Emma? Want to show these folks how the ranch treats its own? Emma looked at Margaret, who nodded. Then the girl took Thornhill's arm with a dignity beyond her years, and they walked back inside together. The dancing had begun. Awkward country reels, couples forming lines. Margaret found a seat and watched, feeling like an outsider at her own life. Then Jack appeared beside her. Miss Bellamy, would you do me the honor? Margaret blinked. What? A dance. Unless you'd rather sit here looking miserable all night. I don't dance. Sure you do. Everyone dances. Come on. He extended his hand, and something in his expression, kind, earnest, utterly genuine, made Margaret take it. They joined the line just as a new reel started. Jack was a competent dancer, leading her through the steps with patience. Margaret stumbled more than once, but he never commented, just steadied her and kept going. You're doing this to make me look less pathetic, Margaret said as they turned. I'm doing this because half these people think ranch folk are uncivilized brutes, Jack replied. Figured I'd prove them wrong. He grinned. Also, you looked like you needed rescuing. I did. Thank you. The reel ended, and another man stepped forward, Peter, the young hand who'd shown Emma the horses. Then another. Then another. Margaret danced with 5 different ranch hands, and by the end of the 5th dance, she was breathless and laughing. The townspeople were watching, but the tenor of their whispers had changed. Confusion now, instead of condemnation. These rough ranchmen treating their cook with courtesy, even gallantry. It didn't fit the narrative they'd built. Margaret caught Thornhill's eye across the room. He raised his glass slightly, a gesture of approval. Then Emma tugged on Margaret's skirt. Can I try? Dancing? Honey, I don't know if… But Jimmy Carter was already there, bowing with exaggerated formality. Miss Emma, may I have this dance? Emma giggled and took his hand. Jimmy led her through a simplified version of the reel, and Emma followed gamely, her face alight with joy. Margaret watched from the sidelines, her throat tight. This was what Emma deserved, moments of pure childhood happiness, untainted by fear or loss. She looks good, Constance Miller said, appearing beside Margaret. Her earlier hostility was gone, replaced by something that might have been grudging respect. Happy. She is, Margaret said carefully. Look, I spoke out of turn earlier, about the ranch, about everything. Constance twisted her hands. My own situation isn't as perfect as I pretend, and sometimes I take that out on people who don't deserve it. Margaret studied her. Why are you telling me this? Because I saw how you stood up for yourself in there, how you defended your choices without apologizing. Constance's smile was rueful. I used to do that before I got married and learned that wives are supposed to be quiet and agreeable. I miss it sometimes, being bold. Then be bold, Margaret said. Nobody can stop you except you. Constance laughed. Easier said than done. But maybe you're right. She glanced at Emma, still dancing with Jimmy. For what it's worth, I think you're doing a good thing, taking her in. She looks like she belongs with you. Before Margaret could respond, Constance drifted away, back into the crowd. The evening wore on. Margaret's feet ached and her face hurt from forcing smiles, but something had shifted. People were still watching, still whispering, but the edge of cruelty had dulled. They'd come expecting scandal and found instead a woman doing her best, a child who was thriving, and a rancher who stood by his people. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was progress. Thornhill found her near midnight, as the party was winding down. Ready to head back? More than ready. They collected Emma, who'd fallen asleep on a bench, and carried her to the wagon. Margaret held the girl in her lap during the ride home, feeling her steady breathing against her chest. You did well tonight, Thornhill said. I made a scene. You made an impression. There's a difference. He glanced at her. People will remember you stood your ground. Next time will be easier. Will there be a next time? Count on it. Town socials happen monthly. We'll be expected at all of them. Margaret groaned. Thornhill smiled. Actually smiled, not the ghost of one, but a real, genuine expression. Welcome to Ranch Society, Miss Bellamy. They rode in comfortable silence after that, the stars bright overhead and the prairie spreading out in all directions. Emma stirred once, mumbling something about dancing, then settled back into sleep. When they reached the ranch, Thornhill helped Margaret carry Emma to the cookhouse. They laid her on the bed without waking her, and Thornhill paused at the door. Thank you, he said, for doing this, for her, for the ranch. I'm not doing it for the ranch, Margaret said. I'm doing it for Emma, and for me. Why you? Margaret chose her words carefully. Because I spent my whole life believing I didn't matter, that I was too big, too ugly, too much trouble to deserve kindness. And then Emma showed up, and she believed the same things about herself. I couldn't, her voice caught. I couldn't let her keep believing those lies when I know how much they hurt. Thornhill was quiet for a moment. Then, you matter, Margaret. It was the first time he'd used her first name. The sound of it in his voice did something strange to her chest. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. Margaret stood in the dark cookhouse listening to Emma breathe and let herself feel something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. The hope lasted exactly 4 days. On Thursday morning, a woman arrived at the ranch in a hired carriage, her dress expensive and her expression severe. Margaret was pulling bread from the oven when she heard the commotion outside, men stopping work, voices raised in question. Through the window, she watched Thornhill meet the woman at the main house steps. Their conversation was brief, tense. The woman gestured emphatically. Thornhill's posture went rigid. Then they both turned toward the cookhouse. Margaret's stomach dropped. Emma was at the work table, kneading dough, humming tunelessly. She looked up when Margaret moved to the window. What's wrong? I don't know yet, but Margaret had a terrible feeling she was about to find out. The cookhouse door opened. Thornhill entered first, his face carefully blank. The woman followed, her sharp eyes sweeping the kitchen with obvious distaste. Miss Bellamy, Thornhill said. His voice was flat. This is Mrs. Dorothea Walsh. She's from the Children's Aid Society. Margaret's blood turned to ice. I see. I'm here to assess the child's living situation, Mrs. Walsh said. Her accent marked her as East Coast educated, her bearing as someone used to authority. I received a letter from a concerned citizen regarding a young girl being raised in unsuitable conditions. Who sent the letter? Margaret demanded. That's confidential. Mrs. Walsh's eyes found Emma. You must be the child in question. Emma, is it? Emma had gone very still, her hands frozen in the dough. She looked at Margaret with wide, terrified eyes. Don't be frightened, dear. I'm here to help you. Mrs. Walsh pulled out a small notebook. Now, where do you sleep? Here. Emma's voice was barely audible. With Miss Margaret. In the same bed? I have the bed. Miss Margaret sleeps on the floor. Mrs. Walsh's eyebrows rose. The floor, I see. She wrote something down. And where do you bathe? There's a wash basin in the room, Margaret said. We heat water on the stove. No proper bathing facilities, then. More notes. What about education? Is the child receiving any schooling? I teach her, Margaret said. Reading, writing, arithmetic. She's quite advanced for her age. I'm sure you do your best, but you're not a trained educator. Mrs. Walsh walked to the back room, peered inside without asking permission. This is wholly inadequate. A child cannot be raised in such cramped quarters. She's happy here, Margaret said. Her hands were shaking. She's safe, well-fed, cared for, by an unmarried woman living among 30 men in a remote location with no proper supervision. Mrs. Walsh closed her notebook with a sharp snap. I'm sorry, Miss Bellamy, but this situation is entirely inappropriate. The child needs to be placed in a proper home with a married couple who can provide moral guidance and suitable living conditions. No, the word came from Emma, loud and fierce. I'm not leaving. Child, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Emma's chin jutted out, exactly the way Margaret's did when she was fighting. You're here because someone doesn't like that Miss Margaret kept me. Someone who thinks poor people don't deserve to be happy. But I am happy. I'm happier here than I've been since Papa died. Your happiness isn't the only consideration. Then what is? Emma's voice rose. What's more important than whether I'm happy and safe? Propriety, morality, proper upbringing. Mrs. Walsh's tone was firm but not unkind. You're too young to understand now, but when you're older, you'll thank me for removing you from this situation. I won't. I'll hate you forever. Emma, Thornhill said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since the introductions. Go to the main house. Wait for me in my office. But now. Emma looked at Margaret, who nodded slightly. The girl left, slamming the door behind her hard enough to rattle the windows. Mrs. Walsh watched her go. Quite a temper. She's scared, Margaret said. She's been abandoned once already. Now you're threatening to do it again. I'm not abandoning her. I'm finding her a proper home. She has a proper home. Here, with me. Mrs. Walsh's expression softened slightly. Miss Bellamy, I can see you care for the child, but caring isn't enough. The law requires certain standards for child rearing, and this situation doesn't meet them. I'll be making my recommendation to the county judge next week. In the meantime, I suggest you prepare Emma for the transition. And if I refuse to let her go, then I'll return with the sheriff and remove her by force. Mrs. Walsh's voice was gentle but immovable. I understand this is difficult, but I'm acting in the child's best interest. You're acting in the interest of whoever wrote that letter, Thornhill said. His voice was cold. Who was it? Constance Miller? Mrs. Henderson? One of the other self-righteous busybodies who can't stand seeing people find happiness outside their narrow definitions? My source is confidential, as I said, but they had legitimate concerns about a child being raised in what amounts to a bunkhouse kitchen. Mrs. Walsh turned to leave. You have 1 week to make arrangements. I'll return next Thursday with the judge's orders. She left as abruptly as she'd arrived, the carriage pulling away in a cloud of dust. Margaret sank onto the bench, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. Thornhill remained standing, staring out the window with his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. We have to fight this, Margaret said. With what? She's right about the law, about the standards. Thornhill's voice was bitter. We're not married. This isn't a family home. On paper, Emma's living in a cookhouse at a cattle ranch surrounded by rough men. No judge in the territory will side with us. Then we change the paper. The words were out before Margaret fully thought them through. Thornhill turned to look at her. What? You said it yourself. The problem is we're not married. This isn't a family home. Margaret stood, her mind racing. So we fix that. We get married. Make Emma officially part of our household. Give them no legal ground to stand on. Thornhill stared at her like she'd grown a second head. You're suggesting we get married. For real. For Emma. Margaret's heart was pounding. A marriage of convenience, legal only. We can draw up papers, keep everything businesslike. But on the outside, we'd be a married couple raising a child. Mrs. Walsh couldn't touch us then. Margaret, I know it's not ideal. I know it's not what either of us wanted. But what other choice do we have? She stepped closer. You said you'd do right by Emma. This is how we do it. We make ourselves bulletproof on paper. Thornhill was quiet for a long moment. You'd really do that? Tie yourself legally to a man you barely know, just to keep a child you've known for less than 2 months? Yes, Margaret said without hesitation, because that child matters more than my pride or my independence or any plans I had for my life. She matters most. What about what you want? Your own future? My future is making sure Emma has one. Margaret crossed her arms. Unless you have a better idea? Thornhill paced the length of the kitchen, thinking. Margaret could almost see him working through the angles, the implications, the risks. It wouldn't be a real marriage, he said finally. No expectations of anything beyond what's necessary for appearances. Agreed. Separate rooms, separate lives. We'd be business partners who happen to share a last name. Fine. And if either of us wants out, if this arrangement becomes unbearable, we figure out a way to dissolve it quietly. Fine, Margaret said again. Do we have a deal? Thornhill extended his hand. We have a deal. They shook on it, formal as a business contract, which, Margaret supposed, was exactly what this was. I'll ride to town tomorrow, Thornhill said. Speak to the minister. We'll need witnesses, Jack and maybe Peter. Keep it simple. Keep it quiet. When? Saturday, before Mrs. Walsh comes back. He headed for the door, then paused. Margaret, thank you for doing this. Thank you for agreeing to it. After he left, Margaret sat alone in the cookhouse, trying to process what she'd just committed to. Marriage. To Callum Thornhill. A man she respected but barely knew. A man who was still mourning a wife he'd lost 5 years ago. This was insane. This was necessary. This was happening. She buried her face in her hands and tried not to think about all the ways it could go wrong. Emma reappeared an hour later, red-eyed and defiant. Is she gone? She's gone. Is she coming back? Next week, with the judge's orders to take you away. Margaret pulled Emma into a hug. But she's not going to succeed. We have a plan. What kind of plan? Margaret hesitated. Emma was young, but she deserved the truth. Mr. Thornhill and I are getting married on Saturday. It'll make you legally part of our household, which means Mrs. Walsh won't have grounds to remove you. Emma pulled back, her eyes huge. You're getting married? Really married? Really married. Legally, anyway. Margaret tried to explain. It's not a love match, honey. It's a practical arrangement to keep you safe. But you'll be his wife. On paper. And I'll be... Emma's voice was tentative, hopeful. What will I be? You'll be our ward, officially, part of the family. Margaret smoothed Emma's hair. Is that all right with you? Emma threw her arms around Margaret's waist. It's perfect. Margaret wished she felt as certain. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Thornhill rode to town and returned with news that the minister had agreed to perform the ceremony Saturday morning. Jack and Peter would serve as witnesses. The whole thing would take maybe 15 minutes. Margaret had nothing to wear but her 2 shabby dresses. She chose the less worn one and spent Friday evening washing and mending it by lamplight. Emma watched from the bed. You should have flowers. It's not that kind of wedding, honey. Still, every bride should have flowers. Emma slipped out of bed and disappeared into the darkness. She returned 10 minutes later with a handful of prairie wildflowers. Scraggly things, half wilted, but earnestly gathered. Margaret's throat tightened. They're beautiful. Thank you. Will you be happy? Emma asked. Being married to Mr. Thornhill? I'll be happy knowing you're safe. That's not what I asked. Margaret set down her sewing. I don't know, Emma. I don't know what this marriage will look like, or how it'll feel, or whether we'll even be able to stand each other after a month. But I know it's the right thing to do. Sometimes that's enough. Papa used to say doing the right thing is its own reward. Your papa was a wise man. Emma climbed into bed and was asleep within minutes. Margaret finished her mending and tried not to think about tomorrow. Saturday morning arrived cold and gray. Margaret woke before dawn out of habit and lay on her pallet, staring at the ceiling. In a few hours, she'd be married. Margaret Thornhill. The name felt foreign in her mind. She rose, dressed carefully in her mended dress, and pinned Emma's flowers to her collar. Her hands shook as she worked. Emma woke and helped Margaret braid her hair, weaving in more wildflowers. "You look pretty," she said. Margaret looked in the small mirror and saw the same face she'd always seen. Too round, too plain, too much. But the flowers helped. They softened things. "Good enough," she said. They walked to the main house together. Jack and Peter were already there, looking uncomfortable in clean shirts. Thornhill stood on the porch, similarly uncomfortable, similarly clean. His eyes met Margaret's and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe. Or mutual terror. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." They walked to town in near silence. The minister's house sat at the edge of the settlement, a small white building with a cross on the door. The minister himself was elderly, half-deaf, and blessedly incurious about why they wanted such a hasty, quiet wedding. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice quavering. Margaret barely heard the ceremony. She repeated her vows when prompted, heard Thornhill do the same. Their voices were flat, mechanical. This wasn't a celebration. It was a legal maneuver. "The ring?" the minister asked. Thornhill produced a simple gold band. His late wife's, Margaret realized with a jolt. He saw her recognition and shook his head slightly. "Not what you think," his expression said. "Just practical." He slipped it on her finger. It was too big, loose enough to spin. "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." Thornhill leaned in and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to Margaret's cheek. Professional, businesslike. It was done. They signed the register. Jack and Peter signed as witnesses. The minister handed them a marriage certificate. Margaret Thornhill. Official. They walked back to the ranch in the same silence they'd arrived in. Emma skipped ahead, the only one who seemed genuinely happy about the situation. "Thank you," Thornhill said quietly, "for doing this." "You already thanked me." "I know, but it bears repeating." He glanced at her. "We should probably discuss living arrangements." "I'll stay in the cookhouse with Emma." "People will expect you to move into the main house. Into the—" He stopped. "Into the wife's quarters." "Your late wife's quarters." "They're just rooms, Margaret. Empty rooms that haven't been used in 5 years. His voice was careful. "I'm not asking you to replace her. I'm asking you to keep up appearances. If we're married, you should live like you're married." Margaret wanted to argue, but he was right. Mrs. Walsh would be watching. They needed to sell this. "I'll need help moving my things," she said. "I'll send Peter and Jimmy this afternoon." The main house felt enormous after the cookhouse. Thornhill led Margaret upstairs to a suite of rooms on the east side, a bedroom, a sitting area, and a small dressing room. They were dusty but well furnished, nicer than anywhere Margaret had ever lived. "Emma can have the room next door," Thornhill said. "It was going to be a nursery before—" He stopped. "It's never been used. Fresh start for both of you." "Where will you sleep?" "West side, opposite end of the hall." He opened a door to reveal a connecting sitting room between the 2-bedroom suites. "We can share this space for appearances, receive guests here, that sort of thing, but our actual rooms are separate." "And the men? What will you tell them?" "The truth. That we got married to protect Emma from being taken by the Children's Aid Society. They'll understand." Thornhill ran a hand through his hair. "Most of them already thought we were involved anyway. This just makes it official." Margaret walked to the window. From here, she could see the entire ranch, the corrals, the bunkhouse, the cookhouse where she'd spent the last months. It looked small from this height, insignificant. "I'll still cook for the men," she said. "That was our arrangement. I'm not stopping just because I'm your wife." "I wasn't going to ask you to stop. You're good at it. They depend on you." "And I depend on the work." Margaret turned to face him. "I need to be useful, Callum. I need to earn my place here, not just occupy it by marriage." It was the first time she'd used his first name. He noticed. "You've always earned your place," he said. "Marriage doesn't change that." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Thornhill cleared his throat. "I should get back to work. The men will have questions." He headed for the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Margaret, you made a beautiful bride. The flowers were a nice touch. He left before she could respond. Margaret sank onto the settee and stared at the ring on her finger. It spun loosely, too big, borrowed from a dead woman. This was her life now. Emma appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. This is all ours? Apparently. It's bigger than our whole house was, before Papa died. Emma ran to the window. You can see everything from here. Margaret watched the girl's delight and felt some of her own anxiety ease. This was for Emma. That's what mattered. By evening, her meager possessions had been moved to the main house. It took exactly one trip. Margaret stood in the bedroom, her bedroom now, and tried to make it feel real. The bed was enormous, covered in a faded quilt. The armoire was mostly empty except for a few dresses that must have belonged to Thornhill's first wife. Margaret left them there. She had nothing to fill the space anyway. Emma's room next door was smaller but charming, with a window seat and built-in shelves. The girl was already arranging her few belongings with intense concentration. This is mine? She kept asking. Really mine? Really yours. That night, they ate dinner in the main house for the first time. Thornhill had insisted, said it would look strange if his new wife ate in the cookhouse. So Margaret prepared a meal and they sat at the formal dining table like strangers forced together by circumstance, which was exactly what they were. How did the men take the news? Margaret asked. Better than expected. Jack said it was about time. Jimmy made some joke about losing the betting pool. Thornhill cut his meat precisely. They're happy for us. Or pretending to be. And you? Are you happy? Emma asked. Thornhill looked at her, then at Margaret. I'm satisfied we made the right choice. That's close enough to happy for now. It was the most honest thing he could have said. After dinner, Emma went to bed in her new room. Margaret cleaned up in the kitchen, a real kitchen, with a pump sink and a proper icebox and space to move without bumping into walls. Thornhill found her there. You don't have to do that. We can hire help. I like doing it. Keeps my hands busy. He leaned against the doorframe. Margaret, about the sleeping arrangements, separate rooms. We agreed. I know, I just want to make sure you're comfortable, that you don't feel obligated to. I don't. Margaret dried her hands. You've been clear about your expectations, or lack thereof. I appreciate it. My first marriage was a love match, Thornhill said quietly. Real, messy, complicated. When she died, I didn't think I'd ever want that again. The pain was too much. I'm not asking you to want it. I know, but I want you to know that this arrangement, it's not a reflection on you. You're not lacking in any way. I'm just not capable of that kind of feeling anymore. Margaret understood more than he knew. I never expected love, Callum. From anyone. So you're not disappointing me by not offering it. He studied her face. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. It's just the truth. Maybe, but it's still sad. He straightened. Good night, Margaret. If you need anything, I'm down the hall. Good night. She listened to his footsteps fade, then climbed the stairs to her new room. The bed was cold, the space too large, the silence oppressive. Margaret lay in the darkness and thought about the strange turns life took. 2 months ago, she'd been a desperate woman taking a job out of necessity. Now she was married to one of the most successful ranchers in the territory, living in a real house, raising a child. None of it felt real. The door creaked open. Emma's small form appeared, clutching her worn blanket. Can't sleep? Margaret asked. The room's too quiet. I keep thinking I'm dreaming and I'll wake up back in that boarding house with Mama. Margaret lifted the quilt. Come here. Emma climbed into bed and curled against Margaret's side. Is this allowed? Now that you're married? I don't care if it's allowed. You're scared and you need comfort. That's what matters. They lay together in the darkness, Emma's breathing gradually evening out into sleep. Margaret stared at the ceiling and made a silent promise. She'd make this work. This strange arrangement, this business marriage, this cobbled-together family. She'd make it work because Emma needed stability and Thornhill needed peace, and Margaret herself needed to prove that people like her, overlooked, dismissed, written off, could build something worth having. Even if it wasn't perfect, even if it hurt sometimes, even if it was nothing like what she'd imagined when she was young and still believed in fairy tales. Thursday arrived with heavy clouds and heavier dread. Margaret woke early, dressed Emma in her best dress, and prepared breakfast with extra care. Today, Mrs. Walsh would return with the judge's orders. Today, they'd find out if their desperate gamble had worked. Thornhill joined them for breakfast, unusually quiet. He'd dressed formally, his good suit, polished boots, armor for battle. Whatever happens, he said, we present a united front. We're a family. We made this choice together. She has no grounds to separate us. And if she tries anyway? Margaret asked. Then we fight, legally, publicly, whatever it takes. His eyes were hard. I'm not letting that woman take Emma. I don't care what it costs. The carriage arrived at 10. Mrs. Walsh stepped out, followed by a portly man in judicial robes. The county judge, Margaret realized. They'd brought the authority to enforce their decision. Thornhill met them on the porch. Margaret stood beside him, Emma between them. A united front. Mr. Thornhill, Mrs. Walsh said, I've returned as promised with Judge Morrison to finalize the placement of the child. That won't be necessary, Thornhill said. The situation has changed. Mrs. Walsh's eyes narrowed. How so? Miss Bellamy is no longer Miss Bellamy. She's Mrs. Thornhill, my wife. He placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. We were married last Saturday. Emma is now part of our legal household. Mrs. Walsh's face went pale, then red. You can't. This is highly irregular. It's perfectly legal, Thornhill said calmly. We have the marriage certificate. Would you like to see it? Judge Morrison cleared his throat. If I may. Mrs. Walsh, I'm not sure we have grounds to proceed if the child is now part of a legal family unit. But they only married to circumvent my recommendation. It's a sham. Can you prove that? The judge asked. Because unless you have evidence of fraud, a legal marriage is a legal marriage. The child is living with a married couple on a prosperous ranch. That meets all the standards you cited in your report. Mrs. Walsh looked like she'd swallowed something rotten. This is unconscionable. This is legal, Thornhill corrected. And final, Emma stays with us. If you have a problem with that, take it up with the county, but you're not removing her from our home. Margaret held Emma's hand tightly, feeling the girl's pulse racing. Judge Morrison sighed. Mrs. Walsh, I'm afraid Mr. Thornhill is correct. We have no legal basis to remove the child from a stable family home. I'll note in my records that the situation has been resolved satisfactorily. Satisfactorily. Mrs. Walsh's voice rose. They manipulated the system. They married purely to keep the child. And that's their right, the judge said firmly. Many marriages have been formed for practical reasons. It doesn't make them invalid. Mrs. Walsh turned her fury on Margaret. You think you've won, but this won't last. Marriages of convenience never do. And when it falls apart, I'll be waiting to pick up the pieces. Then you'll be waiting a long time, Margaret said. Her voice was steady despite her pounding heart. Because we're not falling apart. We're a family now. Legal, official, and permanent. Get used to it. Mrs. Walsh stormed back to the carriage. Judge Morrison tipped his hat. Congratulations on your marriage, Mr. and Mrs. Thornhill. I wish you all the best. He climbed into the carriage and they drove away, leaving dust and defeat in their wake. The moment they were out of sight, Emma burst into tears. Margaret dropped to her knees and gathered the girl close. It's over, she whispered. You're safe. You're staying. Forever. Emma clung to her, sobbing with relief. Thornhill watched them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked back into the house without a word. Later that night, after Emma had finally cried herself out and fallen asleep, Margaret found Thornhill in his office. He was staring at the marriage certificate on his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. We did it, Margaret said from the doorway. We did. He didn't sound victorious. He sounded tired. Are you all right? I'm fine, just thinking. About how easy it was to lie. He looked at her. We stood there and played loving couple and dutiful parents, and it was all performance. Does that make us frauds? It makes us practical, Margaret said. We did what we had to do. Did we? Thornhill took a drink. Or did we just trap ourselves in something we can't escape? Margaret had no answer to that. She left him alone with his whiskey and his doubts, and climbed the stairs to her too large bedroom. Emma was already there, sprawled across the bed in exhausted sleep. Margaret lay down beside her and stared at the ceiling. They'd won. Emma was safe. So why did it feel like they'd lost something too? The weeks that followed Mrs. Walsh's defeat settled into an uneasy rhythm. Margaret cooked, Emma helped, and Thornhill maintained a polite distance that felt more like avoidance. They were married on paper, living in the same house, raising the same child, but existing in separate orbits that only occasionally intersected. Margaret told herself this was what she'd signed up for, a business arrangement, nothing more. But at night, lying in her too large bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all pretending at something that might have been real if any of them had been brave enough to try. Emma noticed first. Children always did. "Why doesn't Mr. Thornhill eat breakfast with us anymore?" she asked one morning, 3 weeks after the wedding. Margaret cracked eggs into a bowl. "He's busy. Ranch work starts early. He used to make time. Before you got married." Emma's tone was thoughtful, not accusing. "Now he leaves before we wake up and comes back after we're asleep. It's like he's hiding from us." "He's not hiding. He's working." Mama used to say that too, about Papa, when things got bad between them. "He's just working, Emma. He's not avoiding me." But he was. Emma's voice went quiet. And then he got sick and died, and Mama said she wished she'd made him talk to her when she had the chance. Margaret's hand stilled on the bowl. "That's different." "Is it?" Margaret had no answer to that. That afternoon, Jack found her in the kitchen. "Got a minute?" "Always. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong exactly. Just noticed the boss has been driving himself hard lately. Real hard." Jack leaned against the doorframe. "He's out before dawn, doesn't stop till after dark. Yesterday he worked straight through dinner. When I asked if he was all right, he bit my head off." "He's adjusting to the marriage," Margaret said carefully. "He's running from it." Jack's tone was gentle but firm. "Look, I know this wasn't a normal situation. You two got hitched for the kid's sake, not for love. But you're still married, still living under the same roof. Eventually, one of you is going to have to acknowledge the other exists." "We acknowledge each other." "You pass each other in hallways and grunt good morning. That's not acknowledging, that's avoiding." Jack straightened. "I'm not trying to tell you how to run your marriage, but I've known Callum Thornhill for 15 years, and the way he's acting now, it's how he acted right after his wife died. Throwing himself into work so he doesn't have to feel anything. It didn't help him then, it won't help him now." After Jack left, Margaret stood in the kitchen and tried to figure out what she was supposed to do with that information. She'd married Thornhill to save Emma. She'd agreed to separate lives. So why did Jack's words make her chest ache? Because somewhere along the way, without meaning to, she'd started hoping for more. That realization terrified her. The county fair was announced for late September, 6 weeks away. The whole territory attended: farmers, ranchers, townspeople. There would be livestock competitions, racing, games, and most importantly, a cooking competition with a $50 prize. $50. More than Margaret had ever seen in one place. Emma found the flyer on the kitchen table and read it aloud. Open to all amateur cooks, judged on taste, presentation, and creativity. She looked up, eyes bright. "You should enter." "I'm not entering a cooking competition." "Why not? You're the best cook in the territory." "I cook for ranch hands, honey. That's different from competition cooking." "How?" Margaret started to explain, then stopped. How was it different? She could make a biscuit that would make grown men weep. Her gravy was legendary. Her pies had been praised at the town social. Why shouldn't she compete? "Because you'll lose," a voice whispered. "Because you'll stand up there in front of everyone and they'll judge you and find you wanting, just like they always have." "I'll think about it," Margaret said. But she was already planning what she'd make. Thornhill came home late that night, as had become his habit. Margaret was still in the kitchen, testing pie crust recipes. She heard him on the porch, the heavy tread of boots, the pause before the door. He stepped inside and stopped short. "You're still awake." "Couldn't sleep." Margaret rolled out dough with practiced efficiency. "There's coffee if you want it." "Thanks." He poured himself a cup and stood awkwardly in his own kitchen. "What are you making?" "Testing recipes. The county fair has a cooking competition. Emma thinks I should enter." "You should." Margaret looked up, surprised. "You think so?" "I know so. I've eaten your cooking every day for months. You're better than anyone in this territory. Thornhill took a sip of coffee. What's the prize? $50. He let out a low whistle. That's serious money. Too serious for someone like me to win. What's that supposed to mean? Margaret pressed the dough too hard, tearing it. She balled it up to start over. It means the women who enter these competitions are from town. Proper ladies with nice kitchens and fancy ingredients. I'm a ranch cook who works with salt pork and beans. I don't belong in that kind of competition. You're also my wife now, which makes you a proper lady whether you feel like one or not. Thornhill set down his cup. Margaret, you've spent your whole life letting other people tell you what you're capable of. Maybe it's time you decided for yourself. She stared at him. It was the most he'd said to her in weeks. Why do you care, she asked, about whether I enter some cooking competition? Because Emma's right. You're the best cook in the territory, and because… He stopped, seemed to struggle with something. Because I'm tired of watching you shrink yourself to fit other people's expectations. You slapped a man for insulting you. You stood up to Mrs. Walsh. You married me to save a child you'd known for a month. You're not small, Margaret. Stop acting like you are. Her throat went tight. I don't know if I can. Then learn. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I think you'd win. Easily. After he left, Margaret stood in the silent kitchen and let herself cry. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of being seen. Really seen, not just looked at. She entered the competition the next day. The following weeks brought a new energy to the ranch. Margaret tested recipes obsessively, trying to find the perfect balance of familiar and impressive. Emma appointed herself chief taster, offering opinions with the seriousness of a professional critic. The apple pie is good, she announced after sampling Margaret's 5th attempt. But the crust on attempt number 3 was better, flakier. You're right, Margaret made a note. I'll go back to that ratio. Even the ranch hands got involved. Word spread that Margaret was entering the competition, and suddenly everyone had opinions about what she should make. Do that beef stew you made last winter, one hand suggested. The one with the dumplings that melted in your mouth? Nah, do the biscuits, another argued. Those things are legendary. She should do something fancy, Jimmy Carter chimed in. Show those town ladies she's not just a ranch cook. Margaret listened to all of it and made her own decision. She'd make what she knew best, what felt honest. 3 dishes that represented her journey, humble ingredients elevated by skill and care. Thornhill started coming home for dinner again. Not every night, but most nights. He'd sit at the table while Emma chattered about her day, and Margaret tested recipes, and sometimes he'd even smile at their antics. It wasn't love, but it was something. A tentative peace, maybe. The beginning of actually living together instead of just coexisting. One evening, about 2 weeks before the fair, Emma went to bed early and Margaret found herself alone with Thornhill in the sitting room. He was reading the newspaper. She was mending a dress. Normal, domestic, almost comfortable. Can I ask you something? Margaret said. Of course. Why did you really agree to marry me? The truth, not the answer you gave Mrs. Walsh. Thornhill set down the paper. Why are you asking now? Because I need to know if this, she gestured between them, is just obligation to you, or if there's any chance of it becoming something else. He was quiet for a long moment. When my wife died, I thought that was it for me. One chance at love and I'd used it up. I didn't want to feel that kind of pain again. He met her eyes. Then you showed up, sharp-tongued and competent and refusing to back down from anything. And Emma showed up, and suddenly I had people in my house again, people I cared about, and it terrified me. So you ran, Margaret said softly. So I ran, he agreed. Threw myself into work. Kept my distance. Told myself it was just a business arrangement. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. But I can't keep lying to myself, Margaret, because somewhere along the way, this stopped being just business, and I don't know what to do about that. Margaret's heart was pounding. What do you want it to be? He stopped, started again. I want to come home to you and Emma. I want to eat dinner together and talk about our days. I want to watch you win that cooking competition and feel proud of my wife. My real wife, not the one I married on paper. I want that too, Margaret whispered. I've wanted it for weeks, but I was afraid you only saw me as an obligation. You're not an obligation. Thornhill reached for her hand. You're the woman who changed everything, who made this house feel like a home again, who loved Emma when no one else would, who's strong and brave and doesn't even realize how remarkable she is. Margaret's eyes burned. I'm not remarkable. I'm just doing what needs to be done. That's what makes you remarkable. He squeezed her hand. Can we try again? Properly this time. Not as a business arrangement, but as people who actually want to build something together? Yes, Margaret said. Yes, we can try. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the perfunctory kiss at their wedding. This was real, tentative, full of possibility and fear in equal measure. When they pulled apart, Margaret was smiling through tears. Does this mean you'll start eating breakfast with us again? She asked. Thornhill laughed. Every morning, I promise. The county fair arrived on a brilliantly clear Saturday. Margaret woke at 3 a.m. to start preparing her competition dishes. Emma appeared at 4, too excited to sleep. Can I help? Always. They worked together in the pre-dawn darkness, preparing the 3 dishes Margaret had perfected over the past 6 weeks. A beef and vegetable pie with a crust so flaky it shattered at the touch, honey-glazed biscuits with hand-churned butter, and a dried apple tart sweetened with molasses and spiced with cinnamon she'd bought specially from town. Simple food. Honest food. The kind that fed both body and soul. Thornhill loaded the dishes carefully into the wagon. The whole ranch was coming to watch. Jack had declared it a light workday, and the hands were treating Margaret's competition like a sporting event they'd bet on. $5 says she takes first place, Peter announced. 10 says she sweeps all 3 categories, Jimmy countered. Boys, Jack said mildly, let's not pressure the lady. But Margaret felt the pressure anyway. Not from them, but from herself. She wanted this. Wanted to prove she belonged in that competition, that she was more than just an overlooked girl from a forgotten corner of the territory. The fairgrounds were packed. Livestock pens lined one side, game booths another, and in the center stood a large pavilion for the cooking competition. Tables were set up for contestants, judges seated in a prominent row facing the crowd. Margaret recognized 2 of the judges immediately, the banker's wife and Mrs. Henderson. Her stomach dropped. They're going to judge me, she said to Thornhill. The same women who've spent years mocking me. Then prove them wrong. He squeezed her shoulder. Show them what you're made of. The competition began with 15 contestants. Margaret recognized most of them, town ladies with elaborate dishes and expensive ingredients. One woman had made a 7-layer cake decorated with spun sugar. Another presented a roasted duck with cherry glaze. Margaret's simple dishes looked pathetic in comparison. When her turn came to present, she walked to the judge's table with her head high and her hands steady. She set down her pie, biscuits, and tart without ceremony. The banker's wife looked at the offerings with barely concealed disdain. How quaint! Ranch food? Honest food, Margaret corrected. Made with skill and care. Sometimes that matters more than flash. Mrs. Henderson sniffed. We'll see about that. The judges tasted. Margaret watched their faces, trying to read reactions. The banker's wife took a bite of pie and went still. She took another bite, slower this time. Mrs. Henderson tried the biscuit. Her eyes widened. The third judge, a man Margaret didn't recognize, sampled the tart and made a sound of appreciation. They conferred quietly, making notes. Then the banker's wife looked up at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. You may return to your seat, she said. We'll announce the winner shortly. Margaret walked back to where Thornhill and Emma waited, her legs shaking. How do you think you did? Emma asked. I have no idea. The judges deliberated for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Then they stood, and the head judge, the banker's wife, stepped forward. This year's competition brought exceptional talent, she began, but one contestant stood above the rest. Her dishes demonstrated not only technical skill, but heart, food that nourishes the soul as much as the body. Margaret held her breath. The winner of the county fair cooking competition is Margaret Thornhill. The crowd erupted. Emma screamed. The ranch hands cheered like their team had won the championship. Margaret stood frozen, unable to process what she'd just heard. Thornhill pulled her to her feet. Go! Accept your prize! She walked to the judge's table in a daze. The banker's wife handed her an envelope with $50 and shook her hand. I was wrong about you, she said quietly. About your place in this community. You've more than earned it. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. Your biscuits are better than mine. I'm woman enough to admit it. She almost smiled. Congratulations, my dear. Margaret took her prize money and turned to face the crowd. She found Thornhill and Emma in the sea of faces. Emma was bouncing with excitement. Thornhill was smiling, and his eyes held something that looked like pride. No, Margaret realized, not just pride, love. The recognition hit her like a thunderbolt. Somewhere between their business arrangement and now, Callum Thornhill had fallen in love with her. And she'd fallen in love with him. Not the desperate, grasping love of someone afraid to be alone, but the steady, sure love of two people who'd chosen each other despite difficult circumstances and built something real. Margaret walked back to her family because that's what they were now, a real family. And Emma threw her arms around her waist. You won! You actually won! We won, Margaret corrected. All of us. Together. Thornhill put his arm around her shoulders, and Margaret leaned into him. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Not because someone allowed her to stay, but because she'd earned her place through her own strength. That night, back at the ranch, they celebrated with the hands. Margaret cooked a feast, the best meal she'd ever prepared, and everyone ate until they were groaning. The men toasted her victory with coffee and laughter, and Emma fell asleep at the table with a smile on her face. Later, when the house was quiet and Emma was tucked into bed, Margaret found Thornhill on the porch. Quite a day, he said. Quite a few months, actually. Margaret stood beside him, looking out over the ranch. I came here thinking this was the end, the last option before complete failure, and instead you found a home. I found more than that. Margaret turned to face him. I found myself. The person I was supposed to be before everyone told me I was wrong. Thornhill pulled her close. You were never wrong, Margaret. The world was wrong about you. She rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. What happens now? Now we live, he said simply. We raise Emma. We run the ranch. We build our life together. He tilted her chin up to meet his eyes. We stop pretending this is temporary and admit it's exactly what we both wanted all along. A real marriage, Margaret said. A real marriage, he confirmed. If you'll have me. Properly this time. Margaret thought about the girl she'd been when she first arrived. Desperate, overlooked, convinced of her own worthlessness. She thought about the woman she'd become. Strong, capable, loved. I'll have you, she said. For real. Forever. He kissed her under the stars, and this time there was no hesitation, no reservation. Just two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and chosen to make it work. 6 months later, the ranch had transformed. Emma was thriving, learning to read and write under Margaret's patient instruction. The men had accepted Margaret not just as their cook, but as the lady of the ranch, someone they respected and protected. And Margaret had started something new. A small cafe in town, open twice a week, serving the food she'd become famous for. The $50 prize money had been seed capital. Thornhill's support had been the courage she needed. The cafe was always packed. People came from neighboring towns to taste Margaret Thornhill's cooking. The same women who'd once mocked her now praised her skill. The same townspeople who'd whispered about impropriety now brought their families to eat at her tables. Margaret had become, quite accidentally, the most respected woman in the territory. On a warm spring afternoon, almost a year after she'd first arrived at the ranch, Margaret stood in the cafe kitchen and watched Emma help serve customers. The girl had grown taller, healthier, more confident. She laughed easily now, her trauma healing slowly but surely. Thornhill appeared in the doorway. How's business? Better every week. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. I'm thinking about expanding, maybe opening another day. You sure you can handle it? I can handle anything, she smiled. Haven't you learned that yet? He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, not caring who saw. I learn it again every day. Emma made a disgusted noise. You two are gross. You're just jealous, Margaret teased. I'm 9 years old. I don't want to be kissing anyone. Emma stuck out her tongue. But I guess I'm glad you love each other, even if it's gross. Margaret and Thornhill exchanged glances over her head. Emma had started calling them both by first names months ago, Callum and Margaret, not Mr. Thornhill and Miss Margaret. It felt right, natural, like a real family. That evening, after the cafe closed and they drove back to the ranch, Emma fell asleep in the wagon between them. Margaret looked at the sleeping child and felt her chest swell with love so fierce it almost hurt. "You know what the best part is?" she said to Thornhill. "What's that?" "I came here thinking I was saving Emma, but she saved me. Gave me a reason to fight for something besides survival." Margaret stroked Emma's hair gently. "She gave me a family when I thought I'd never have one." "We saved each other," Thornhill said. "All three of us. That's how family works." They carried Emma to bed and tucked her in, then stood in the doorway watching her sleep. "Do you ever think about that day I arrived?" Margaret asked quietly. "How different everything could have been." "All the time." Thornhill put his arm around her waist. "If you'd been a worse cook, I might have let you go. If you'd been weaker, the men would have driven you away. If you'd said no when I proposed—" "I did say no," Margaret reminded him. "The first time. But you said yes when it mattered." He pulled her close. "And I'm grateful every single day that you did." They walked to their bedroom. Their shared bedroom now, not separate spaces connected by a sitting room. Margaret had moved her things into Thornhill's room 3 months ago, and they'd converted her old room into a proper study where she tested recipes and kept her cafe accounts. Progress in small steps. Margaret got ready for bed and looked at herself in the mirror. She saw the same face she'd always seen, but now it was different somehow. Not because she'd changed physically, she was still too large by the town standards, still plain by conventional measures, but she looked happy, content, like someone who'd finally found where she belonged. "What are you thinking?" Thornhill asked from the bed. That I spent 20 years believing I wasn't worth loving, and you proved me wrong." Margaret turned to face him. "Thank you for that." "I didn't prove anything. You did that yourself." He held out his hand. "I just had the good sense to recognize what everyone else was too blind to see." Margaret took his hand and climbed into bed. Thornhill pulled her close, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Outside, the ranch was settling into sleep. Horses in the corrals, cattle in the distant pastures, men in the bunkhouse trading stories before lights out. Emma safe in her room. Everything in its place. Home. Margaret had spent her entire life being overlooked, dismissed, told she didn't matter. And in the end, she'd proved all of them wrong, not by changing herself, but by refusing to let their judgment define her worth. She'd slapped a man who insulted her. She'd stood up to a society woman determined to take Emma away. She'd married for practicality and found love anyway. She'd entered a cooking competition everyone expected her to lose and won. She'd built a life from scraps and determination, and it was a good life. Not perfect. Nothing ever was. But real. Honest. Hers. And in the process, she'd learned the most important lesson of all, that the girl no one chose had always been worthy of choosing. She just needed to choose herself first. Margaret fell asleep in her husband's arms, in a bed she'd earned, in a house that was truly home. And for the first time in her life, she slept without fear, without doubt, without the weight of other people's expectations crushing her spirit. She slept like a woman who'd won, because she had. The sun rose on another day at Thornhill Ranch. Margaret woke before dawn as always, but this time Callum woke with her. They dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Emma, and walked to the kitchen together. Margaret started coffee while Callum built up the fire. A simple routine, practiced over months, comfortable as old shoes. "What are you making today?" he asked. "Thought I'd try a new bread recipe for the cafe." Margaret measured flour. "Emma wants to help when she wakes up. She's getting good. You've taught her well." "She's a natural. Better instincts than I had at her age." Margaret smiled. "Sometimes I think about her mother. Wonder if she knows what an incredible daughter she abandoned." "Her loss," Callum said firmly. "Our gain." The sun crept over the horizon, painting the kitchen gold. Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Morning," she yawned. "Morning, sweetheart." Margaret handed her a cup of milk. "Sleep well?" "Dreamed about the cafe." "About serving 100 people and running out of food." Emma grinned. "But then you made more food appear like magic and everyone was happy." "Not magic," Margaret said. "Just hard work and planning." "Same thing, really." Emma climbed onto a stool. "Can I help with the bread?" "Always." They worked together as the ranch woke around them. Men heading to their duties, horses neighing in the corrals, the everyday sounds of a working operation. But inside the kitchen, there was peace, purpose, family. This was the life Margaret had built from nothing, from rejection and pain and the desperate decision to keep putting one foot in front of the other even when everything seemed hopeless. And it was more than she'd ever dreamed possible. Because the truth was, Margaret Bellamy, now Margaret Thornhill, had never needed someone to choose her. She'd needed to choose herself, to decide she was worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth loving. Everything else had followed from that one choice. The girl no one chose had become the woman who chose her own path, who built her own family, who earned her own respect. And in the end, that was the only choice that had ever mattered.